the B part to this problem, they would like us to look at the risk and the return of assets F, G, and H, make some observations, and then maybe discuss which asset we would actually choose. Now, you have to begin with the thought that all of these assets are acceptable. If it's not an acceptable asset, it doesn't meet your criteria, you wouldn't be doing all this stuff. You just eliminate it long ago. So these are assets that have made the cut. We'd be happy with any of these assets, is the way you have to look at this. Now, if you just look at return, the price of return is always greater risk. If all you were going to look at was the expected return, and they ask you to make some observations, then the observation you'd make is that, well, the price of more return is always more risk, so asset G would be the one that would have the greatest risk. It's got the greatest return. Asset F would have the least amount of risk because it's got the least return. But we also have the standard deviation. And again, all things being equal, the greater the standard deviation, the greater the risk. So as you look at these assets, you would have to conclude that asset G has the greatest standard deviation, the greatest volatility in return. So it should be deemed to be the riskiest asset. And asset F over here would indeed have the least amount of risk among these different assets. And again, that goes back to the observation we made about return. The price of greater return is greater risk. And again, you see the low return asset has the least risk, the high return asset has the greatest risk. But now we look at coefficient of variation. Now, this is the statistic that you would want to use if you were going to have to choose between assets. And again, as I mentioned in the previous video, what you want to be is what's called a rational investor. That is, you want the most return for the least amount of risk. Again, assuming that all these assets are acceptable to us, we'd be happy with F, G, or H. Which asset would you want to take on? Well, the answer is you want to take on the asset that adds the least amount of risk for every unit of return, which means you want to buy the asset, choose the asset that has the lowest coefficient of variation. And in this case, the lowest coefficient of variation, of course, is asset H. So if you had to choose between these assets, if they were all equally acceptable, then you would choose asset H. It takes on, you get less risk per unit of return, and that's what you want to do as a financial manager. You want to add assets that give you the least amount of risk for every unit of return that you get. And again, this is statistics, and this is the B part to the problem we just worked.